Hello, my name is Sybil Ludington. You may remember me as the brave girl who rode my horse to alert the neighbors during the Revolutionary War when the British were coming to Danbury. General Tryon was on his way north to Danbury, and you may have seen the big brass statue of my horse and I in front of the library here in Danbury. I'm here to tell you about that ride and my life in later years. I was born on April 5th, 1761, in Branford, Connecticut. I was the firstborn child of my parents, Henry and Abigail, and not long after that we moved to Fredericksburg, New York, which is now called Ludingtonville, located north of Carmel, New York. In addition to working as a farmer, my father was a grist mill owner where people brought their grains to be ground into flour. He served in the military for over 60 years, including during the French and Indian War. He was loyal to the British Crown until 1773, when he switched sides and joined the Patriots in the American Revolution. Father had land along a route between Connecticut and the coast of Long Island Sound that might have ended up in the hands of the British. He was promoted to colonel of his local regiment. In April 26, 1777, Colonel Ludington received word from a horse rider that the nearby town of Danbury, Connecticut, was under attack by the British troops and needed help. The British had entered Danbury and found some American military supplies, stolen some, destroyed others, and got drunk on rum and whiskey. They began ransacking the town, burning and looting. Barrels of molasses, sugar, flour, and medical supplies had been destroyed, and some houses were burned to the ground. At the time, Father's regiment of about 400 men had disbanded for the planting season and were miles apart at their respective farms. The rider who came to us was too exhausted to continue, and Colonel Ludington needed to be focused on preparing for battle. He asked me to ride to alert the townspeople of the danger and tell the troops to return to Ludington's farm ready to fight. So I rose to the cause. I saddled my horse Star and rode off into the night. I was only 16 at the time. I left around 9 p.m. from my home in Paterson, New York. My travels took me to the towns of Putnam County and Dutchess County, New York, around Lake Carmel to Mahopac, looping back up through Reading Corners, around Old Stormville Road, and the town of Pecksville back to my home. I rode all night through dark woods and in the rain, covering about 40 miles, but I wasn't afraid. It was my duty in my heart to complete this task and alert the people and gather the troops. Our lives and future depended on my ability to keep going. I even had to fight off a man with my father's musket who tried to rob me as I rode. Nothing could stop me. By the time I returned home, hundreds of soldiers were gathering to fight the British. Father's troops arrived and joined the other Connecticut troops, pushing the departing British soldiers back to Ridgefield, into what would become known as the Battle of Ridgefield. From there, General Tryon's troops were driven back to the coast and into the sea, and they left our shores defeated. Later, George Washington visited my home to thank me for my ride that saved so many lives. And General Rochambeau, the French commander who fought with the Americans, also thanked me. These were great honors, but really, I was just doing what was necessary to keep us all safe. Actually, after that time, no one remembered my ride. Some said it was like the historic ride of Paul Revere in Massachusetts 2 years earlier, when he rode to alert the people, "The British are coming, the British are coming." He rode out of Boston, through Lexington, into Lincoln, where he was captured. But my ride faded into history until many years later. After that night, I went back to helping my parents with household chores for several years. My mother had 4 more children, making us a family of 12 children in all. Then it was time for me to find a husband and marry. On October 24th, 1784, when I was 24, I married Edmund Ogden of formerly of Connecticut, age 29. Edmund had enlisted in the Army the year before my ride and served as a sergeant during the war. He had also served on the ship Bonhomme Richard, commanded by Captain John Paul Jones. After our wedding, we lived in Fredericksburg, New York. 2 years later, I gave birth to my son Henry. Edmund and I ran a farm with a tavern on our property. Business became slow, so we sold our farm and moved to Catskill in Greene County, New York. Henry was 7 years old and attending a school called The Landing. Edmund and I hoped to open a business in our town and raise our family in our new home along the Hudson River. But in 1799, Edmund came down with yellow fever. This was a terrible illness. It was called that because people turned yellow. The virus was spread by mosquitoes. He was suffering terribly and was sent to a hospital in New York City, where he later died. I didn't have much money. My son Henry was only 13. Life wasn't easy for us, but I managed to raise enough money to send Henry to school to help him to become a lawyer. By 1803, I had raised enough money, $735, to buy a tavern on the corner of Greene and Main Streets in Catskill. I was 42 years old and the only woman to apply for a license to run a tavern in Catskill in 1803. 23 men had applied that year. I was considered an extraordinarily independent woman for this time period. In 1810, Henry was a lawyer and married Julia Peck of Catskill. They presented me with my first grandson, Edmund, on February 20th, 1811. In 1810, when I was 49 years old, I sold my tavern for $2,275, over 3 times what I had paid for it. With the money, I bought a house in Unadilla, New York, where I lived with my son and family for 30 years. My first grandson, Edmund, graduated from West Point and became a military hero, like his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and grandmother. Sadly, my son Henry died in 1838. I asked the government pension for my husband's service in the Revolutionary War. I was asked to write letters proving that I was married to Edmund. These letters contained a lot of important information about my life. However, the government did not supply the money I asked for because I could not prove that I had been married to Edmund. In the sad end, I died the next year, February 26, 1839, at age 77 in poverty. I was buried next to my parents in Paterson, New York. Forward to 1907, finally, after 130 years, my ride was written about in the family memoirs in a book called Colonel Ludington, a Memoir. My story was also written in the Connecticut Magazine. In 1935, the DAR, Daughters of American Revolution, got involved. They are an organization where their members can trace their family back to those who fought in the Revolutionary War. They campaigned to get me recognized as a hero. They set up road markers which were placed along the route I rode that fateful night. In 1961, the DAR commissioned a large bronze statue of my horse and me to be created by the world-famous sculptor Anna Hyatt Huntington to commemorate my ride. Star looked so beautiful and ready to run through the night. The likeness of me is exciting and full of eagerness for the task ahead. Further still, in 1975, the DAR helped get my likeness printed on an 8-cent U.S. postage stamp, which was dedicated in my honor. I understand this is quite a tribute to my achievement. Well, that's my story. Thank you for listening. I want you to see me as more than just a 16-year-old girl who rode into history. But before I stop, I want to tell you one thing. When you see the statue of me riding the horse, my arm is raised with a stick in the air. That's not to hit the horse. Don't worry, it's not to hit the horse. It was so I could ride right up to the farmhouse door and bang on the door to wake the people and sound the alarm. Thank you for listening to my story.